I've played tons of arcade games and I've played tons of NES games, and if you know anything about these two libraries, is that from an identity perspective they're often very different. Sometimes you get a beautiful surprise where the NES version carves out its own legacy, and that's what my Better at Home series was all about. They were just games that were good, if not better at home. But then there's the other side, the dark side, the what were they thinking side, games where the NES version just couldn't live up to the big, loud, quarter-munching beast sitting in the arcades. And that's where today's topic comes in, thanks to one of our epic firefighters, Merch Credit. I've been challenged to do the flip side, arcade or bust. Today I'm going to talk about 10 NES ports that dropped the ball so hard it rolled under the couch and you never found it again. Let's begin. Let's start with a heavy hitter, Konami's Life Force, or Salamander if you were hanging out in Japan for whatever reason. It was one of the best shooters of the 80s. The arcade version was gorgeous, grotesque, and unique because it didn't just stick to horizontal scrolling. No. It alternated between horizontal and vertical levels, which kept you on your toes. The backgrounds were these pulsating bioorganic nightmares like you were blasting your way through some intergalactic digestive tract. With a new power-up system based on capsules, you could build your loadout the way you wanted it. Speed boosts, missiles, ripple lasers, options, force fields. It gave the game this amazing flow where you felt in control of your ship's evolution. Plus, you could grab a friend and play co-op, which made the difficulty way more fun. Balanced, addictive, visually striking, this was Konami firing on all cylinders. And then the NES port showed up like the awkward cousin nobody wanted to invite to dinner. On the surface, it still had the Life Force name, but really it was more of a remix of Salamander. The stages were heavily redesigned. If you knew the arcade version, you were going to be confused, maybe even angry. The NES version looked okay, but the bioorganic spectacle was missing, and the cramped level design combined with slowdown made it punishing in all the wrong ways. It wasn't the thoughtful challenge of the arcade, it was the NES struggling to keep up. To me, the arcade version felt like a true Gradius spin-off, a natural evolution of the formula. The NES version felt like an undercooked remix with less personality, less balance, and even more frustration. If you really want to enjoy Life Force the way it was meant to be enjoyed, do yourself a favor, fire up MAME, or just find a cabinet. Oh, Clax. If you walked into an arcade in 1990, this is a game you likely couldn't avoid. The cabinet literally told you, it is the 90s, and there is time for Clax. And yes, there was. The game was hypnotic. Tiles dropped down a conveyor belt smooth as butter, stacking in neat little lines while the colors popped off the screen. The pacing was perfect, slow and manageable at first, then ramping up until your brain was in overdrive trying to keep up. Add in the digitized voices and the sharp sound effects, and you had one of the most addictive puzzle games of its era. It wasn't just fun, it was stylish. But then came the NES version, and man, this one was rough. The NES's limited color palette turned those bright, clear tiles into muddy little blobs. And in a puzzle game where clarity is everything, that's a death sentence. The iconic arcade voices were replaced by sad little beeps, and the gameplay speed felt off, sometimes too sluggish, other times choppy when the screen got busy. The NES version technically functioned, but it lacked any sense of personality. In the arcade, Clax was vibrant, loud, and addicting. On the NES, it felt like playing Connect 4 on a rainy day while someone hums elevator music in your ear. It wasn't unplayable, but it was missing the energy that made it special. Few arcade games were as stylish as Marble Madness. Atari dropped this in 1984 and it blew people's minds. You weren't just pressing buttons, you had a trackball, and that gave you precise physical control over your marble. The isometric obstacle course was sleek and futuristic with bold geometric designs and crazy hazards. Enemies, ramps, drops, it felt like you were navigating a neon death maze. The music was experimental and trippy, composed in stereo, which was kind of a big deal back then, and it all came together in this fast, smooth package that was unlike anything else in the arcade. The NES version, however, ripped away the game's heart. No trackball, just a D-pad. Controlling the marble with that thing was like trying to push a bowling ball through a doggy door. Instead of smooth gliding, you were overshooting, undershooting, constantly fighting the controls, and the visuals lost their clean arcade look, turning into blocky, muddy shapes. Even the quirky soundtrack was flattened into something that didn't really carry the same vibe. And the game, which was already short in the arcade, felt even thinner on the NES. Marble Madness was sleek and addictive. On the NES, it's clunky, frustrating, and empty. This is one of the few occasions where I can say the controller actually made the game. Taito's The New Zealand Story was pure arcade charm. You play as Tiki, a little kiwi bird trying to rescue his kidnapped friends. Armed with arrows and cuteness, you bounce through colorful, vibrant levels full of enemies, traps, and even hijackable vehicles. But don't let the cute exterior fool you. This game is hard. Tricky jumps, tight spaces, enemy patterns that punish sloppy play, but it always felt fair, and the cheerful soundtrack kept you grinning through the challenge. Then came the NES version, and oh, what a downgrade. The bright, lively visuals were stripped down to dull, washed-out graphics. The levels were simplified to the point of being butchered, enemies lost their personality, and the controls felt stiff. Even Tiki himself, who was full of charm in the arcade, looked more like a blob with feet. The soundtrack, once bouncy and catchy, became tinny and repetitive, the kind of music you'd want to mute after 10 minutes. Think Highlight. The arcade version was a hidden gem bursting with character, and the NES version ultimately felt like a bad bootleg. If you want to experience Tiki's adventure properly, you gotta go arcade. This is gonna be a hot take. Capcom followed up 1942 with a sequel that blew the doors off, 1943. The arcade version was pure energy, smoother graphics, bigger explosions, and a rocking soundtrack that kept you locked in. You had power-ups, a health bar instead of a cheap one-hit death system, and those glorious lightning screen clears that wiped out everything in sight. Add in two-player co-op, and it was exactly the kind of fast-paced chaos that made arcade shooters so addictive. But on the NES, the thrill was gone. Planes shrank down to tiny sprites, backgrounds turned into what seemed like a dull wallpaper, and the explosions lost all of their punch. The energetic arcade soundtrack got flattened into our basic beeps, and whenever the screen filled up, slowdown hit like an anchor. What was supposed to be frantic and pulse-pounding became sluggish and boring. Arcade 1943 was an adrenaline rush. The NES version was like trying to watch fireworks through a foggy window. Playable? Absolutely. But compared to the arcade? Nah. If Gradius had a cousin who was into cosplay and slapstick comedy, it would be Parodius. Konami went off the deep end here. Same solid shooter mechanics, but instead of aliens and space fleets, you fought penguins, octopi, and giant lips, all to the tune of ridiculous remixes of classical music. It was colorful, fast, funny, genuinely fun. It had the polish of a serious shooter, but the absurdity of a comedy skit. What more could you want? But the NES version tried to cram all of that madness into 8-bit hardware, and the result was cramped and, to be honest, kind of bullshit. The vibrant chaos was dulled down to bland sprites. The music, which was half the joke in the arcade, sounded like crap. Worst of all, slowdown hit constantly, sucking life out of the chaos. Arcade Parodius was alive, a living cartoon that was just as hilarious as it was fun to play. NES Parodius was like listening to someone explain the punchline of a joke without actually telling it. Silkworm was a blast. I had actually never heard of it, and then one day I did, and I kind of got into it. It stood out because of its hook. You could play either as a helicopter or as a jeep. Two players would work together, one covering the skies, the other rumbling across the ground, both mowing down waves of enemies. It was frantic, flashy, and smooth, with big explosions and varied stages. It kept you coming back because every run felt different depending on which role you played. But on the NES, all of that personality melted away. The Jeep felt sluggish and the helicopter felt weak and the backgrounds were just repetitive. The crisp arcade visuals were turned into blocky sprites and the booming explosions were reduced to forgettable blips. The pacing slowed to a crawl when the action picked up, killing the fun completely, which is something that we see quite often when it comes to a lot of sprites on the screen. That's just an NES thing. But I will stand by the fact that in the arcade, Silkworm was a chaotic buddy shooter with style. On the NES, it was lifeless. Few games were as iconic as Gauntlet. You had 4 players huddled around a cabinet, blasting through endless dungeons, smashing monster generators, and stealing food from each other while a booming voice reminded you, it wasn't just a game, it was a party, an event, a reason to bring quarters and a friend. The sheer chaos of the arcade experience made it legendary. The NES port cut that magic in half. Literally, 4-player madness was reduced to 2. The hordes of enemies shrank to tiny groups, the vibrant chaos slowed down whenever the screen got busy, and the iconic voice samples, gone! Instead, you just had generic beeps and dull music. What would have been a social frenzy in the arcade was now just a quiet dungeon crawl. Arcade Gauntlet was one of the greatest group experiences of the 80s. NES Gauntlet was reheated leftovers. Without the chaos, it just wasn't the same. I actually played this the other day. SNK's POW, pretty gritty, pretty cool. You're breaking out of a prison camp, throwing punches, stealing weapons, and smashing through waves of guards. Big sprites, polished animation, solid pacing. It was exactly what you wanted from a late 80s beat-em-up. And with a 2-player co-op, it wasn't just an escape story, it was an escape story with a friend by your side. The NES stripped that co-op away immediately, which already kneecapped the game. The graphics were blocky, the pacing slowed, and the sound effects were weak. The gritty, desperate prison break vibe turned into a repetitive, empty trudge. Without the co-op chaos, it lost half its soul. The arcade version was tense, gritty, and fun. The NES version was a hollow imitation that missed everything that made it shine. Oh man, Narc. If you were around in 1988, this was the game parents warned you about. Williams Entertainment went full-on excess here. Digitized sprites, over-the-top violence, rocket launchers, bloody explosions, snarling dogs, and a cabinet that literally shouted, "Say no to drugs!" which we ignored. It was outrageous, shocking, and absolutely unforgettable. On the NES though, they gutted it. The digitized detail, gone, replaced with tiny blocky sprites. No violence because of Nintendo's policies. The blood was stripped away. The blood on the cover was even changed to yellow and made it look like hot piss, which is all that this game deserves. Slowdown and flicker constantly bogged it down, and the pounding arcade soundtrack was replaced with looping noise. What was once shocking and raw was suddenly bland and exceptionally boring. In the arcade, Narc was brutal, loud, larger than life. On NES, it was quiet. Nothing special. And that's it, 10 NES ports that just couldn't live up to their arcade originals. Some games thrive at home, but these belong in the smoke-filled, neon-lit corners of the arcade where they were born. So what about you? Did you ever rent an NES game expecting the arcade magic only to feel cheated when you got the downgraded version? Let me know your war stories in the comments, and hey, maybe we'll do a part 2. Until then, remember, some games are fun anywhere, but these are arcade or bust. If you made it to the end of this video, you're already home with us. We're a gathering of video game enthusiasts that love to remember when life was just a little bit easier to live, so feel free to subscribe. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly aligns with the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.